from the 1930s in a special programme for April the 1st.
Adolf Hitler relaxing in a beer garden in Bavaria. This amateur film has never before been seen in public. Shot in 1936, the film is part of an extraordinary archive, the discovery of which casts new light on the events of the pre-war period. March 1936, German troops occupy the Rhineland. As troops mobilized along the frontiers of Europe, the military preparations were discreetly watched from an upstairs window by Adolf Hitler and Unity Mitford, enfant terrible of the British aristocracy. For 50 years, this familiar moment of film history has been taken at its face value. It is, however, not what it appears to be. In this program, evidence is produced of a conspiracy involving the Nazi leadership and the highest echelons of British society. A conspiracy of silence, which for half a century has been kept from public knowledge.
It all started actually when I took this job for the Open University, doing a program which involved research of the 1930s.
Freelance film researcher Bob Haslam had expected a routine job and began the viewing of thousands of feet of newsreel film. But in the second week of his work, he was to make a rather curious discovery.
Well, I was looking at that sequence of the German occupation of the Rhineland in 1936. I mean, I'd seen it dozens of times before. But it suddenly occurred to me that there's something wrong with that window, because it didn't look right. It didn't fit with the rest of the area, you see what I mean? Well, I began to think I've got in front of me something rather intriguing, something of a puzzle. But you see, I'm not an expert on architecture, so I couldn't do any more about it at that stage. But I have a friend of mine who is an expert on the subject, and I rang him. His name is Richard Seller.
Bob Haslam sent him some stills from the film.
I was only too delighted to have a look at them. And indeed, when I did look at them, there were one or two things that struck me as being slightly strange.
Architect Richard Seller quickly pinpointed the problem. It was a sash window.
Certainly, as a generalized statement, sash windows are very rare in Germany. And obviously the next question was, which Bob asked me, was if you saw a picture of a sash window, which was supposedly taken in about 1930, which country would you think of? So I would have said England.
Richard was determined to follow his hunch, that this piece of film was shot not in Germany, but in England. To Bob Haslam, the idea seemed preposterous.
I thought the whole thing is so unlikely, let's forget it. But Richard actually got obsessed with this idea. He was quite convinced that there was something in it. And he actually persuaded me that there might be as well. So I got more and more involved.
The only way to prove their theory was to find the actual house.
Seemingly rather silly task, but we were helped in this by another detail in the picture, which was an iron gas lamp bracket. Now that struck me as certainly a clue, an identification clue. Of course, the eagle might possibly have taken us straight back to Germany. But however, I thought it was certainly worth doing some research on late Georgian, early Victorian ironwork, gas lamp brackets, decorative things. So we consulted a lot of experts, read a lot of books, and eventually found that the eagle was the trademark of the Shoreditch Iron Foundry, which had been a very successful local, small foundry from the 1820s till the turn of the century.
For the next 3 months, Bob and Richard spent almost every weekend driving around London's East End. They had discovered that most small foundries of the Victorian period sold their products locally. So they confined their search to within 1 mile of the site of the Shoreditch Iron Foundry. The Blitz and post-war redevelopment have changed the face of the East End almost beyond recognition. They knew the odds were stacked against them, but they kept on looking.
We turned off Commercial Road, one of our Saturday jaunts, and turned into a gap in some dilapidated flats, looking across into Cable Street, and saw the facade of a house which looked extremely similar to the picture, and on closer inspection was, without a shadow of doubt, the picture. It had a gas lamp and a sash window.
Bob Haslam and Richard Seller had proved their case, that this house had been visited by Unity Mitford and Hitler. But when had they been there, and why?
What's that?
A possible clue was provided on a wall only 50 yards away, a mural commemorating the Cable Street riots of 1936. Richard Seller had no doubt that this provided the answer.
The frightening conclusion was that Hitler and Unity Mitford had been standing at that window, 230 Cable Street, watching not a procession of troops from Germany, but a procession of mostly fascists.
The Cable Street riots of October 1936 were the first major clash between Britain's fascists and the forces of the left.
Crossing the Tower of London, 5,000 fascists rally to their mobilization for the much-advertised march through the East End. And Sir Oswald Mosley, black shirt leader, arrives at Royal Mint Street to inspect his followers. In step here, thousands of East Enders prepare to resist the invasion, barricading the path the fascists will take. Communists, Labourites, and Jews jam the fascist route, resisting the peaceful efforts of the outnumbered police to clear the way.
If Hitler was secretly present at the Cable Street riots, someone must have helped to organize his visit. It is just conceivable that Unity Mitford could have done this on her own. But she was not the only member of the British aristocracy present on that day. Amidst the ranks of the British Union of Fascists was this man, Lord Tern. Lord Tern died in 1968. Most of his family now live abroad, and the family home, Aspern House, is derelict. But his youngest son lives in London and was prepared to talk about his father's relationship with Unity Mitford.
Unity Mitford was a friend of my parents, which is hardly surprising, considering my father was a member of the British Union. And I think she probably was a house guest at one time or another. There was a myth that Hitler had visited England, but I dismissed it out of hand. I mean, if he had come to Aspen, everyone would have known about it, including the servants, especially the servants.
One of the domestic staff at Aspern House in the 1930s was Ethel Farnley. Miss Farnley is now retired and lives in a cottage in the former grounds of Aspern House.
When they sold out the big house, everything of value was sold, of course, but then there were some bits and pieces left that they were going to throw out. And they said I could take whatever I wanted. I went down to the cellar, and there was a trunk down there. It's not very big. It was very damp in the cellar, and it was getting pretty nasty, so I thought I'd better bring it out and keep it safe in my shed, which is quite dry, really.
It soon became abundantly clear that in rescuing this trunk from a damp cellar, Ethel Farnley had performed a service to history far greater than she could have imagined. The trunk contained a selection of old photographs, some of them in rather poor condition. A more exciting find came next, cans of 16mm film. And then from the same trunk, Ethel Farnley produced a diary written by Unity Mitford. It had survived the passage of half a century virtually intact. But not so the film. Shot on unstable nitrate stock and kept for years in damp conditions, much of this unique material has been tragically lost to the world. But using the most advanced techniques, it has been possible to salvage several minutes of film. This material is essentially a home movie shot by Unity Mitford. Together with a diary, it represents a most remarkable collection of evidence. An actress reads from Unity Mitford's diary.
Munich, 30th of September, 1936. Final meal before the Führer and I leave for England. Our mission absolutely has to succeed, otherwise Britain and Germany may end up going to war, which would be just silly. Fortunately, there are masses of people in England who think the Führer is a perfect pet and was only too justified in taking back the Rhineland. With a little help from Wolf, who's an absolute marvel at organising people, I'm certain we can get the English to see where their true interests lie.
Wolf was Unity's pet name for Hitler. As a diary later reveals, she was a keen home movie enthusiast. Here we see Hitler on the right of the picture, cheerfully ruffling the hair of a little German boy. This piece of film, taken on a 16mm amateur camera, is unfortunately the only one to survive from the material shot in Germany. Unity's film doesn't cover Hitler's arrival in England. With radar not yet invented, it would have been comparatively easy to fly in secretly to some remote airstrip. Or were strings pulled at a high level to allow Hitler to enter by one of the Channel ports? We may never know. What is clear from the diary is that Hitler and Unity did indeed witness the Black Shirt riots.
London, 5th of October, 1936. Dreadful violence in the East End yesterday, when the Jews and the Communists attacked a perfectly peaceful march by the British Union of Fascists. The Führer was nervous about being arrested, so Tom arranged for us to watch the march from an upstairs window.
Tom was the name by which Oswald Mosley was known to his friends and associates.
I persuaded one of Tom's adjutants, a sweet boy with the most delicious blue eyes, to shoot off a few feet of film of me and Wolf at the window. But Wolf got upset and confiscated it. The Führer was quite impressed by the black shirts, but thought the British police a trifle namby-pamby.
The political background to scenes like these has been documented in a number of authoritative studies by Professor Enid Routledge, who confirmed that the diary was authentic. But is it credible that a secret meeting with Mosley was the only purpose behind Hitler's visit?
I don't think we must imagine that he would come just to talk to anybody in England. We must remember that Hitler at this time was a head of state. He would expect to meet his peer, and I think we can guess exactly whom he had in mind.
The garden party this year was a royal reception, but owing to the mourning for the late king, there will be no court this year.
While still Prince of Wales, Edward VIII had scandalized popular opinion by making a speech apparently sympathetic to Nazi Germany. 2 years later, following the abdication, he was to visit Hitler and Goebbels in Germany. Was he there continuing a relationship with the Nazi leadership which had already begun in England?
Still no reply from the palace. Why is the king being so dreadfully standoffish? Doesn't he realize that he's the one person who can make Baldwin see sense? Oh, if only Baldwin would understand how much we have in common with the Germans. Then together we could put paid to that sewer Stalin.
With the growing constitutional crisis over his relationship with Mrs. Simpson, the king must have had other things on his mind. More than ever, he was the focus of world attention.
King Edward's romance holds the attention of the world, and in London the drama of empire unfolds. Crowds like this surround Buckingham Palace to prove to the king that all the world loves a lover. Except perhaps Prime Minister Baldwin, leader of the government's fight against the marriage. But with Winston Churchill rallying the...
While Britain's leaders met and argued, Adolf Hitler was playing a waiting game in a remote corner of the Kent countryside. These idyllic sequences from the home movie show Unity and Hitler at Aspern House, home of Lord Tern. The diary makes it clear that Unity was not wasting her time.
I telephoned Bunny 3 times today, but he's such a silly little man. He hasn't grasped the urgency of putting a word in the royal ear.
A telegram from the mysterious Bunny shows that Unity's fears were groundless. The meeting between Hitler and Edward had finally been arranged. But that meeting was some time ahead, and Hitler was growing impatient.
The Führer has started biting his nails again, and is as ratty as a fishwife. I'm doing my best to keep him amused. Tomorrow I shall smuggle him into the new show at the Phoenix. He adores Noel Coward.
The earth became heaven for you were there.
You were there. I saw you and my heart stopped beating. You were there. And in that first enchanted meeting, life changed its tune. The stars, the moon came near to me. I dreamed like magic seemed to be clear to me, dear to me. You were there. Your eyes looked into mine.
Today the Führer turned to me with the sweetest look in his eyes and told me about his amazing plans for an Aryan race. I can't begin to explain how simply sensible it all sounds.
It may seem odd that in the middle of this important mission, Hitler was taking an interest in music, but it was in fact all too typical. Joachim Andernach is Germany's leading authority on the psychology of music under fascism.
Deep down, Hitler hated philosophy, theology, even medicine. In fact, any rigorous intellectual discipline. Fascism worked through the emotions, and that's where music came in. In Hitler's case, when he sat quietly, listening to music, he was in fact at his most dangerous. During the putsch which wiped out Röhm and the Brown Shirts in 1934, Hitler spent the entire night listening to songs from the Rosenkavalier.
On October the 27th, 1936, a historic meeting took place on an English country estate. The diary makes it clear what happened.
28th of October. Yesterday afternoon at Aspern House, the king finally met the Führer. Wolf wouldn't let me join them, so I waited on the terrace. They spent ages in the summer house.
In agreeing to meet Hitler, there's no doubt that Edward was playing with fire. Professor Routledge.
We've got to consider the situation he was in at the time. It wasn't just his position as king that was at risk. The future of the monarchy was at risk. It wasn't all that safe then. If there'd been one small leak, we would live in a republic today.
They finally came out and walked by the ornamental lake. The king looked very preoccupied and stood tossing pebbles into the water. When they returned to the house, Wolf was very white and tight-lipped. I knew immediately that the whole thing had been a ghastly failure.
Hitler had seen Edward as a potential ally. I think it's just possible that he wasn't quite clued up as to the limitations of the power of a constitutional monarch in this country. And the king may have given him a flea in his ear. But I think it's quite clear that the Führer felt that Edward had failed him.
As Edward tried to deal with the enormous public pressures upon him, it's now clear that Mrs. Simpson had already made a decision.
Just heard that Luff Simpson means to withdraw gracefully, so Edward can remain king. Wolf spent the entire morning on the phone to Berlin.
On November the 2nd, 1936, BBC engineers at Alexandra Palace transmitted what is often claimed to be the world's first public television program.
It's Helen Mackay. Just looking at you from out of the blue. Don't take a path, but settle down and look at us.
Curiously, Unity seems unaware that the world's first public television transmissions had begun in Berlin the previous year.
November the 3rd. How foolish I have been. I had thought the Führer would be amused by the new British invention of television. I was wrong.
It's clear from this piece of film that Hitler was not amused by the BBC's dubious claims. He was not a man to forgive easily.
The Crystal Palace, which has been a £2 million London landmark for more than 80 years, has gone. This is all that was left of the Exhibition Palace, whose name and fame were known throughout the world.
After a gap of 50 years, we now know that fire was no accident. Unity's film shows that both she and Hitler were at the Crystal Palace on the night of the fire.
I'm afraid Wolf only has himself to blame. How silly to confuse Alexandra Palace with Crystal Palace. I kept trying to tell him, but he just kept shouting about the Reichstag. However, the Führer doesn't seem at all put out by his mistake. He muttered something about it being nothing compared to what he'd do to London if he had to.
The ruins of the Crystal Palace were still smouldering as the House of Commons assembled to hear a statement released by the King.
After long and anxious consideration, I have determined to renounce the throne, and I am now communicating this, my final and irrevocable decision.
Unity's diary entry for December the 11th, 1936, reveals for the first time Hitler's connection with the abdication of Edward VIII and sheds new light on newsreel film shot earlier that year at Mrs. Simpson's residence in Cannes.
Edward will soon be on his way to France, where the woman he loves has been waiting in that dreary villa.
Unity's diary had earlier made it clear that Mrs. Simpson had decided not to marry Edward. What was it that caused Mrs. Simpson to change her mind?
Thank heavens for those telephone calls Wolf made to Berlin. How typical of the Führer to be so strong and decisive.
Here, the diary is infuriatingly vague as to precisely what action Hitler took to influence Mrs. Simpson's decision. Who were the mysterious figures seen visiting the villa in the south of France? Could they have been SS men sent on the orders of the Führer? And did Edward ever find out that Hitler had played a role in his downfall? With Edward removed from the throne, Hitler could now look around for a weaker and more pliable figure. Showing remarkable political acumen, he settled on this man, Neville Chamberlain, then Chancellor of the Exchequer.
In an arming world, we couldn't be the only great country disarmed. We simply had to build our defense forces again, and we had to pay for it. It'll involve an expenditure of some hundreds of millions of pounds.
Those hundreds of millions of pounds were not so easy to find. As British industry slumped and the Jarrow marchers descended on London, Hitler's approach was simple and direct. He secretly offered Chamberlain a loan of 200 million Reichsmarks. Chamberlain accepted. Hitler and Unity returned to Aspern House.
Our mission has been successful, thanks to the ingenuity of the Führer. The secret loan negotiated yesterday means that Wolf has got Chamberlain in his pocket. He says the umbrella is so weak-willed and pathetic, he is absolutely bound to become Prime Minister.
Unity Mitford set up her camera to record this moment of triumph. A rather chilly champagne breakfast on the terrace. While Unity indulges in champagne, it's likely that Hitler is consuming his favorite drink of mineral water, or possibly carrot juice. But their time in England was drawing to a close.
17th of December. Written in haste. Lord T has been approached by agents of British intelligence. We must flee within the hour. I can't think who betrayed us. The only person to ask any prying questions here was a stupid little slut of a maid called Ethel something or other, and she scarcely has the brains to cut a slice of bread.
Did Ethel Farnley really not remember seeing Unity and Hitler?
I didn't know. Together, you mean? I'd have known Hitler, wouldn't I? If I'd seen him, wouldn't I?
Tomorrow we return to Germany. Long live National Socialism. Long live the fatherland. Heil Hitler.
This is the last entry in Unity's diary. One remaining fragment of film shows Hitler in pensive mood. It's thought to be the only piece of film in existence which shows the Führer picking his nose. Hitler's secret visit to England, concealed for so long from public knowledge, raises a host of profound political questions. But one question which can be answered is this. Why did Chamberlain agree to the German dismemberment of Czechoslovakia in 1938? Far from achieving the triumph he had claimed, it's now clear that Chamberlain was involved in a desperate attempt to prevent the secret loan of 1936 becoming public knowledge. Thus, Hitler was given the Sudetenland, and Chamberlain was given a piece of paper.
And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine.
Latest electronic techniques reveal for the first time what was written on that paper.
I owe you 20 million Reichmarks. N. Chamberlain.
Danke, Adolf Hitler.
On March the 24th of this year, Bob Haslam, Richard Seller, and Ethel Farnley were convicted of fraud after selling to Thames TV a film archive which purported to show that Joseph Stalin had visited Blackpool in 1937.
Was it in a real world, or was it in a dream? Was it just a note in some eternal theme?
Your eyes looked into mine and faltered every word. The color of the whole world altered, all became true. My universe crumbled into, the earth became heaven for you.
Looked into mine and faltered every word. The color of the whole world altered, all became true. My universe crumbled into, the earth became